the more likely it is to have them come into the
higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to pay in shops.
Attention! The moment we've all been waiting for has finally arrived, and it's not just an economic crisis, it's a real blow to the global energy system. We're all used to stability, but what happens when one of the largest sources of energy for the US suddenly decides, enough is enough? When Canadian oil, which had been flowing to America on the cheap for decades, suddenly started flowing in the opposite direction in order to tap the huge markets of Asia, America was left stranded. But what led to this? How did a country that many considered an economic ally decide to break years of dependence on the US and start its own game in the global market?
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
It all started with Trump's decision to impose a 10% tariff on Canadian oil. At this point, America was in for a stunning reaction. Everyone expected it to be a short-term economic move that would force Canada to relent. But Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney gave a response that no one predicted. Canadian oil companies, instead of waiting for easing, started contracting with countries like China, India, and Japan. And as a result, the US lost one of its cheapest energy suppliers, and the global energy map was flipped.
Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with...
What happened next? China, in an effort to strengthen its position, made a move that shook America to its core. It didn't just start buying oil. It bought options that allowed it to manipulate flows, sending oil not just to America, but to Japan, India, and potentially even Korea. The deal gave China a strategic advantage that proved to be a national security threat to the United States.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, of course, I'm going to respond. And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
But that was only the beginning. A new challenge appeared on the horizon: gas. Yes, you heard right. With new routes for liquefied natural gas, Canada was poised for an energy revolution. Imagine that this small country, which seemed to be just a source of raw materials for the US, suddenly became a key player on the global stage. And this whole game started with a single mistake, a decision that should have brought Canada back to its knees, but instead severed a decades-old bond.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
All of this has caused not only an economic storm, but also political tension at the highest levels. But what will happen next? How will the US deal with this energy shock? And worst of all, what does this turnaround mean for the future of the US economy, which now has to compete with those who have long been its allies? Subscribe to find out how this energy crisis changes everything.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
In April 2025, the world witnessed one of the most sweeping turning points in global energy. Canadian oil, which for decades had been an indispensable resource for US refiners, suddenly went in the opposite direction. This seemingly insignificant change dealt a blow to an established system where the US had always been the leader. Now the energy they were used to getting on the cheap has started flowing toward China, Japan, and India, leaving US policymakers at a loss. But what happened? How could it be that the US, the country that controls the world economy, suddenly found itself in a situation where it was not just losing supplies, but also becoming dependent on those it once considered its allies?
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
It all started when, in 2018, the US administration decided to impose economic sanctions and a 10% tariff on Canadian oil and gas. At the time, no one could have predicted that this move would lead to such dramatic consequences. Trump was sure that this measure would force Canada to give in, because it has always been easier for the US to dictate its terms to its neighbor. However, he failed to take one thing into account. The Canadian authorities were no longer willing to be economic junior partners in relations with America. Prime Minister Mark Carney, known for his independent politics, realized that this was a chance for Canada to finally strengthen its position on the world stage. Instead of looking for ways to negotiate with Trump and mitigate the damage from the tariffs, Canadian oil companies began looking for new markets. Several major players such as Suncor, Cenovus, and Canadian Natural Resources have accelerated deals with buyers in Asia. China, in particular, has become an important player in this process. While US companies still saw Canadian oil as an affordable commodity, Chinese oil giants began to sign long-term contracts with Canada, guaranteeing themselves a stable supply for decades to come. China went beyond just buying oil. It offered Canada something much more important: investment and flexibility.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Once China started buying Canadian oil, the situation began to evolve rapidly. Instead of just buying oil at low prices, China offered Canada a new strategy. It started working not only with oil, but also with infrastructure. In 2023, China's Rangshan Prochemical Corporation invested billions of dollars to build new terminals to export oil to Canada's Pacific coast. Instead of sending oil only to the US, new horizons have opened up for Canada. Energy that previously went to US refineries for processing was now a commodity in international markets. This new infrastructure allowed Canada to enter the highly competitive markets of Asia and Europe, becoming a real player in the global energy game.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
But the most important point was not just economic cooperation. China was committed to a long-term strategy, and its moves went beyond just buying oil. China began introducing its oil refining technology to Canada, investing in modernizing petrochemical plants. Canadian companies like Cenovus began contracting with Chinese corporations that offered more favorable terms than US buyers. Unlike the US, China did not insert political terms into the contracts, but simply offered Canada better prices, guaranteed long-term supply and technology.
But I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
When these deals became public, it caused a shock in Washington. Canadian oil producers, used to cheap prices from US companies, began to see China as a more stable and profitable partner. But most importantly, The deal meant the end of the American energy monopoly. The US, once considered a major consumer of Canadian oil, now found itself in a position where it was losing its strategic advantage. For them, losing access to cheap Canadian crude was not just an economic blow, it was a matter of energy security. Once China became an important buyer of Canadian oil, Canada began to reassess its role in the world. With the help of Chinese investment and the growing demand for Canadian oil in Asia, it was able to strengthen its economic independence. Canada gradually became an energy superpower, and its new role in the global energy market began to be reflected in global oil and gas prices.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Thus, Trump's move, which seemed to be an attempt to get Canada to mend its relationship with the United States, was the beginning of the end of America's energy monopoly. The strategy of sanctions, which other countries had handled so easily, turned out to be a disaster for the US. This move only accelerated the processes that led to losses in the energy sector and the strengthening of China's position as a new major player in global energy politics. Canadian oil was no longer just a commodity, it became part of the global political game, and the US now had to face a reality where it was no longer the only player on the field. When China began to introduce its interests into the Canadian energy market, events quickly took an unexpected turn. Going beyond oil purchases, China began to intervene more actively in strategic processes. By investing in modernizing Canada's energy infrastructure, Chinese companies were not just buying raw materials, they were offering Canada flexibility it had never dreamed of when trading with the United States. China offered Canada new agreements on completely different terms. Instead of the strict political and economic clauses that the Americans had imposed, the Chinese offered Canada flexibility. China, in turn, became the first to invest in the development of new export terminals that would ensure uninterrupted exports across the Pacific Ocean, bypassing US territory. This presented a real challenge to the US, which was used to all Canadian oil going through its ports and being refined by its refineries.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
But here's the question that began to grate on American minds. What does this mean for global energy security? After all, if China, rather than the US, became the primary buyer of Canadian oil, it meant not only losing control of Canadian crude, but also losing its position in the oil market itself. This was not just an economic threat, it was a strategic move aimed at changing the balance of power in the global energy industry. But events unfolded even faster. Canadian oil companies such as Suncor and Canadian Natural Resources began entering into contracts with Chinese and Indian corporations, which led to the creation of a new energy bloc. The US, finding itself in an unenviable position, could do nothing about this new alliance. China, investing billions in new infrastructure and logistics, was effectively closing the door on America. While the Americans continued to threaten Canada with tariffs, China began to seek not just oil supplies, but control of key energy resources. American analysts began sounding the alarm when they learned that Chinese corporations had achieved such a level of influence that they could now manipulate the flow of oil and gas throughout the Pacific, posing a threat not only to the United States, but to all countries dependent on a steady supply.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
It wasn't long before China became a major player in the energy game. Unlike the US, China offered Canada flexible contracts that allowed oil producers to change destinations depending on market conditions. That flexibility, as it later turned out, was key for Canadian companies, which had long suffered from low oil prices from US refiners. The Canadians, empowered to manipulate supply, began working with high-profile Asian buyers, enabling them to get more for their oil than before. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., relentlessly continued to ignore the realities of the changes taking place. Trump, unable to see the full extent of the crisis, kept pushing his tariff course, hoping it would lead to a quick victory. However, even the most trusted experts began to raise concerns. This situation, in which Canada was beginning to be perceived as an independent supplier, meant that America was losing its control, not only in the oil market but also in the gas market. All of this was compounded by the fact that China and India were beginning to enter into contracts that eliminated any political risk and provided for guaranteed purchaser for decades to come. The stakes were rising, and with each new contract, the reality became tougher for US policymakers. At first, it was an economic event, then it became a strategic crisis. With each passing day, China became a more dominant player in the Canadian oil market. As early as 2025, when Canadian oil companies began sending oil to China, Japan and India, the US began to realize that it was losing a key supplier that was once just a source of cheap crude for it. As early as August 2024, the first ships carrying Canadian oil left the shores of the Pacific Ocean bound for Asia, and from that point on, US refiners began to feel the shortage. What was the next step? It was, of course, a disaster for the US. An economy that had relied on cheap raw materials suddenly found itself in crisis, facing rising prices. The problems with Canadian oil became real. However, the crisis was not just limited to rising oil prices. It signaled to US industrialists that the economy could begin to collapse. Consumers accustomed to relatively low prices began to feel an uptick in the cost of everything from gasoline to groceries on store shelves.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
What was happening to America at this time? The states began to experience enormous economic problems. First and foremost, it had to do with energy security. The loss of Canadian gas and oil caused a sharp increase in prices, which affected not only domestic consumers but also industry. As early as 2028, some petrochemical plants in the US were forced to close because they could not compete with Asian buyers who could afford to pay more for Canadian oil and gas. This economic crisis affected other sectors. Industries began to close their doors, many of which depended on cheap energy resources. Domestic production in the US began to decline rapidly. In addition, in response to Trump's threats to continue imposing new tariffs on Canadian goods, Canada took another step that finally cemented its independence in the energy market. In 2029, Canadian authorities decided to completely cut off the supply of electricity to the United States. This decision was not only for economic gain, but also to demonstrate Canada's strength and willingness to pursue its own foreign policy independent of the United States. As a result, many US states, including such industrialized states as Michigan and New York, began to experience electricity shortages, causing massive blackouts and disruptions to all infrastructure. At the same time, the US began to experience energy problems amid aging infrastructure and high costs of extracting oil and gas from its own subsoil. US shale gas technologies, which had recently been highly efficient, now began to fail. In 2030, the US found that its oil production could not meet domestic needs, and alternative supplies from countries such as Venezuela and Saudi Arabia were proving too expensive. At this time, while America continued to look for a way out, Canada continued to develop new energy projects and contract with Asian countries that were becoming increasingly important to the global energy supply. The reorganization of the energy landscape also meant changes in the political picture of the world. Canada, with its increased influence in the energy field, was entering into negotiations with other major players, including Europe, India, and China. The new alliance that formed around Canadian oil and gas was so powerful that the US found itself at the center of geopolitical isolation. The loss of control over Canadian energy resources was not just an economic loss, but a blow to America's status as a world leader. Against this backdrop, a new challenge has emerged for the US: its energy dependence on Canadian oil and gas, which until a few years ago seemed unchanged, has now become its weakness. While America is wasting energy trying to regain its position in the energy sphere, Canada, as an independent player, is strengthening its ties with Asian countries, strengthening its position as a global energy leader.